On Christmas morning, Ilara Quinn sat in the same room as her family, watching her father hand out gifts to everyone. Everyone except her. He didn't forget. He chose not to. And that was the moment everything changed. On Christmas morning, Ilara Quinn sat quietly in the corner of a room that had never truly belonged to her. The tree was tall, perfectly decorated, gold thread ribbons, glass ornaments, warm white lights that reflected softly against polished marble floors. Everything about the house suggested warmth, celebration, family, but none of it reached her. Across the room, Victor Quinn stood near the fireplace, smiling as he handed out gifts like a man performing a ritual he had perfected over decades. His voice carried easily, light and controlled, each word measured to match the image he wanted others to see. Helena Quinn opened her box first. A bracelet, gold, delicate, expensive. She smiled the kind of smile that didn't come from joy, but from confirmation, as if the gift simply proved something she already believed, that she deserved it. Livia didn't even wait. She laughed the moment she saw the brand name on her box, a soft, practiced laugh that belonged more to cameras than to real moments. "Oh, I already know this is good," she said, glancing briefly at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone before opening it. It was exactly what she expected. Of course it was. Even Livia's fiancé received something personalized, thoughtful, carefully chosen to signal belonging. Ilara watched it all with a quiet stillness that almost looked like patience. Her coffee sat untouched in her hands, slowly losing heat. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask. At first, she told herself there must be something missing. A box still hidden. A mistake waiting to be corrected. People didn't do things like this on purpose, not families. But as the final ribbon fell to the floor and laughter filled the room, the absence beside her became louder than anything else. No box, no name, no acknowledgement, just space where she should have existed. It wasn't the lack of a gift that hurt. It was the precision of the omission. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes from someone already stepping away internally. "Was there something left in the hallway?" The room didn't go silent. That would have meant they cared enough to notice. Instead, Helena turned her head slightly, her expression shifting not into confusion, but into something colder, something sharper. "Why would there be?" The question wasn't genuine. It was surgical. Ilara felt it land. Still, she held her posture. "I thought maybe—" Helena cut her off gently, almost politely. "Why waste money on you?" There it was. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. A sentence so clean, it didn't leave room for misunderstanding. Livia tilted her head, studying Ilara with a kind of detached curiosity, like observing something mildly out of place. "You're not really on our level," she added, her tone light, almost conversational. "You know that, right?" Victor said nothing. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, glanced briefly at Ilara. Just long enough to acknowledge she was there, not long enough to defend her, and then turned back to the others. "Let's finish before breakfast gets cold." That was his answer. Not words. Choice. And somehow, that silence said more than anything else could have. Ilara smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was the kind people wear when dignity is the only thing left they can still control. Inside, something shifted. Not breaking. Not yet, but aligning, because in that moment, a thought surfaced quietly, almost calmly. "This isn't new. This is just the first time they've stopped pretending." She placed the coffee down carefully, as if the action itself required precision. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. That, more than anything, made it easier. Ilara stood, smoothed the sleeve of her coat, and walked toward the door. Behind her, laughter continued. Wrapping paper tore, glasses clinked. The world she had spent years trying to belong to carried on exactly as it always had, unchanged, uninterrupted, untouched by her absence. And that was when it finally became clear. She had never been part of it, only useful to it, outside, The winter air was sharp, clean, honest in a way the house had never been. Ilara exhaled slowly. For a brief moment, her chest tightened. Not from sadness, but from something heavier, something more difficult to name. Recognition. Then it passed. And what replaced it was something far more dangerous than anger. Silence. Not the quiet of weakness, but the quiet of decision. Ilara Quinn did not cry on the drive back. That, in itself, felt like a quiet kind of revelation. The city stretched around her in muted winter tones. Soft gray skies, bare trees lining the streets, storefront windows glowing faintly with leftover holiday displays. It was all beautiful in the distant, impersonal way things often were when you were no longer trying to belong anywhere. Her phone buzzed once. Then again, she didn't look at it. Not yet, because something inside her had already begun to rearrange itself, piece by piece, with a clarity she had never allowed before. By the time she reached her condo, the silence followed her inside. Not heavy, not oppressive, but clean, almost deliberate. She hung her coat, set her keys down, and moved through the space slowly, as if reacquainting herself with a life that had always been hers. Just separate, independent, unacknowledged. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and turned it on. The soft hum of it, heating water, grounded her in a way the noise of her family never had. No performance, no hierarchy, no audience, just function. She leaned against the counter, staring at nothing in particular. And for the first time since that morning, her mind didn't replay the scene. It moved forward. Strange. A quiet thought surfaced beneath everything else, almost detached. How clarity arrives not when people hurt you, but when they stop hiding that they meant to. The kettle clicked. She poured the water, watched the steam rise, then carried the cup to the counter and sat down. That was when she began. Not with emotion, with memory. Precise, structured, controlled. She pulled a notepad toward her and started writing. Not in sentences, not in explanations, but in facts. 6 years. That was how long it had been since the first time she stepped in. 6 years since Victor Quinn had nearly lost everything. The showroom, the brand, the illusion. She remembered the call clearly. Late, strained, full of words like temporary, misunderstanding. Just a short-term issue. The kind of language people used when they were already drowning, but still pretending they could touch the bottom. Back then, she had believed something simple, that helping once would change how they saw her, that competence would translate into respect, that being necessary would eventually mean being valued. She almost smiled at that now. Not because it was funny, because it was naive in a way she could no longer afford. Her pen moved steadily. Property acquisition through holding structure. Outstanding liabilities cleared. Vendor exposure renegotiated. Seasonal credit line personally guaranteed. Each line was clean, objective, undeniable. And yet, for 6 years, none of it had ever been spoken aloud in that house. Because to acknowledge it would have required something her family had always avoided. Rebalancing the hierarchy. They had called her work paperwork. A small career. Background. Support? It had been easier that way. Easier to accept what she gave if they could pretend it wasn't power. Her fingers paused briefly over the page. Another thought slipped in, quieter this time, but sharper. They didn't misunderstand you. They understood exactly enough and chose not to look closer. That was the difference, and that difference changed everything. Ilara reached for her laptop, opening folders she hadn't touched in months, not because they weren't important, but because she had never needed to prove anything before. Not like this. Deed documents, transfer records, corporate filings, everything was there. Exactly where it had always been. Exactly as it had always been. Uncontested. Unquestioned. Because no one had ever thought to question it. Not her father. Not her mother. Not even Livia, who spoke about the business as if it were something she would inherit simply by existing within it. They had lived inside a structure they didn't understand. And Alara had let them for years. The realization didn't come with regret, just clarity. She printed the first document, then the second, then more. Paper slid into a neat stack. Each page another quiet confirmation of something that had never needed validation. Until now. Her phone buzzed again, longer this time, insistent. She turned it over and finally looked. Victor. Helena. Livia. Multiple calls, no messages yet. That would come later. First confusion, then irritation, then urgency. The pattern was predictable. It always had been. She set the phone back down without answering. Because for the first time, she wasn't reacting. She was choosing. The tea had gone untouched beside her. She didn't notice. Didn't need to. Because something far more sustaining had already settled into place. Control! Not loud. Not aggressive. Just present. Real. She gathered the documents into a single stack and aligned the edges carefully, almost absently. A small, precise gesture. But it carried weight. Because somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the silence, beneath the years of being overlooked and dismissed, a decision had already been made, not in anger, not in pain, but in understanding. And understanding, Alara realized, was far more dangerous than either. She reached for her phone again, scrolled once, then stopped. Not at her family's names, at another contact, one she rarely needed, one she trusted. Her attorney. For a brief moment, her thumb hovered above the screen. Not hesitation, just acknowledgement, because she knew with absolute certainty that once this step was taken, nothing would go back to the way it had been. Then again, it never really had been what she thought it was. Alara pressed call, and just like that, the silence ended, not with noise, but with consequence. The call lasted less than 12 minutes. That was all it took to begin dismantling 6 years of quiet accommodation. Alara Quinn didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. On the other end, her attorney listened without interruption. The kind of silence that came not from uncertainty, but from recognition. Professionals like her didn't need dramatic explanations. They understood patterns, power, timing. When Alara finished outlining the situation, there was a brief pause, then a single question. Do you want to proceed cleanly or decisively? Alara didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, because she did. She had known the moment she walked out of that house. Her gaze drifted toward the stack of documents on the counter. Ownership records, guarantees, agreements that had quietly shaped the foundation her family stood on. For years, she had treated those papers like safety nets. Now, she saw them for what they really were. Leverage. Decisively, she said. The word settled into the room with a calm finality. No anger, no hesitation, just direction. Her attorney exhaled softly, almost approving. Then we don't warn them, she replied. We act. That, more than anything, made something inside Alara still. Because warning would have been kindness, and kindness, she realized, had been the language that allowed everything to continue exactly as it had. Strange. A thought moved quietly beneath the surface. How people call it cruelty when you stop giving them access they never earned. They moved quickly after that, efficiently, professionally, the way things happen when emotion is no longer the driver, when structure takes over. By the end of the call, 3 immediate actions were already in motion. The first, withdrawal. Ilara's personal guarantee on the seasonal credit line, the one that kept inventory flowing, that kept appearances intact, that allowed the showroom to exist as if nothing fragile sat beneath it, would be formally removed. Effective immediately.
The second, termination.
The building occupancy agreement, which had drifted for years in that vague, unspoken space families like to call understanding, would be converted into something far less comfortable. 30 days. No extensions, no assumptions. The third, control. The brand name, quietly transferred to her years ago during a moment no one else had paid attention to, would now require authorization. Written, explicit, enforceable. Alara listened as each step was outlined, confirmed, translated into action. There was no drama in it, no raised stakes, just inevitability, like gravity finally being acknowledged. When the call ended, the apartment felt even quieter than before. Not empty, resolved, she stood there for a moment, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of the counter, as if grounding herself in something physical, while everything else shifted into place. This was the point of no return, not legally. That had always been clear, but relationally, psychologically, once people saw you differently, once they realized you were not where they had placed you, there was no going back to being small again. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message. Livia, did you seriously just leave like that? Elara read it once, then set the phone down. No response, because explanations implied obligation. And for the first time, she felt none. Instead, she reached for the documents again, reviewing them not for accuracy. She already knew they were airtight, but for clarity. Presentation mattered. Not for her, for them. Because people like her family didn't understand truth unless it was packaged in a way they couldn't ignore. Her eyes moved across the page. Dates, signatures, transfers, each detail a quiet contradiction to the narrative they had built around themselves. A narrative where Victor Quinn was the architect, where Helena curated, where Livia inherited, and where Elara existed somewhere off to the side, unimportant, replaceable. The faintest hint of something, not quite satisfaction, not quite bitterness, touched her expression. More like recognition. They didn't erase you. The thought surfaced, steady and precise. They just assumed you would never step out of the space they assigned you. That assumption had been their greatest comfort, and now it would become their greatest mistake. She gathered the documents into a clean stack and placed them inside a simple white box she found in a drawer. Unremarkable, minimal, intentional. For a moment, she considered adding something else. Some note, some explanation, some final statement that would translate years of silence into a single, undeniable message. But the idea faded as quickly as it came. Words would only give them room to argue, to reinterpret, to minimize. Documents didn't do that. Documents ended conversations. She closed the lid. The soft click echoed faintly in the room. Then she reached for her phone again and typed a single message to her attorney. Send it tomorrow morning. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, the reply came. Understood. That was it. No dramatics, no warnings, just execution. Elara placed the box near the door. Ready, waiting, not as a threat, not as revenge, but as something far more precise. Correction. She turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet city below. Somewhere, far across it, her family was still moving through their day exactly as they always had. Unchanged, unaware, secure in a version of reality that had never required them to question anything. That would end soon, not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. And as Elara stood there, watching the reflections shift across the glass, one final thought settled into place. Not sharp, not emotional, just true. They taught you how little you meant to them. Now they're about to learn how much that cost. The package arrived at 8:27 in the morning. It was placed just outside the glass door of the showroom. Neat, unremarkable, almost elegant in its simplicity. White wrapping, no branding, no message visible from the outside. Exactly the kind of thing clients sent after the holidays, which was why no one questioned it. Inside, the showroom was already awake. Soft music played beneath the quiet movement of staff adjusting displays, straightening cushions, aligning glassware, checking lighting angles that had to look effortless but were anything but. Every detail curated, every surface controlled. Livia Quinn noticed the package first. Of course she did. She always noticed anything that might be seen. Oh, finally, she said lightly, crossing the room in cream-toned heels that clicked softly against the floor. I was wondering when the late gifts would show up. One of the staff glanced up. Should I log it? No, it's fine, Livia replied, already reaching for it. It's probably from one of the New Year clients. Her tone carried that familiar confidence, the kind that came from a life where things simply arrived when they were supposed to. She brought the package inside, setting it on the central display table, the one she usually used for filming, the one positioned perfectly under natural light. Without thinking, she smiled slightly. Then she peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a white box. Clean, minimal, heavy in a way that suggested importance, not luxury. That was the first moment something shifted. Not visibly. Not yet. Just a flicker. A pause half a second longer than necessary. Still, she lifted the lid. And then everything stopped. For a brief, suspended second, the world inside that showroom held its breath, because what Livia saw wasn't a gift. It was structure. Documents, clipped neatly, organized, intentional. At the very top, a single page, formal letterhead, sharp typography, unmistakable in tone. Lego. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that the smile disappeared before she even realized it had been there. What is it? One of the staff asked, hesitant. Livia didn't answer. She didn't seem to hear. Her fingers moved slightly, lifting the first page, scanning. Eyes moving faster, then slower, then stopping altogether. The color drained from her face. And then she screamed, not loud in volume, but sharp, precise, the kind of sound that cuts through space and forces everything to react. Helena Quinn appeared first, her composure already in place before she even reached the table. What is going on? She asked, voice controlled, measured. Then she saw the papers. And for the first time in years, she sat down. Hard, as if something beneath her had simply disappeared. Victor Quinn emerged seconds later, still speaking into his phone, mid-sentence, mid-performance. Yes, we can finalize that consultant. He stopped, because he recognized the letterhead. Even from a distance, there are some things people don't need to read to understand. He ended the call without finishing the sentence, stepped closer, reached for the top page, and as his eyes moved across it, the shift happened. Not subtle, not contained, visible, immediate, the kind of change that happens when certainty collapses too quickly to manage. No, he said under his breath. Not denial, recognition. Livia's voice came next, thinner now, strained. What is this? But she already knew. Not in detail, but in weight. Helena's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table, her eyes scanning the lines again and again, as if repetition might change them. It didn't. Victor flipped to the next page, then another. Faster now, desperate, looking for something. An error, a loophole, a misunderstanding. There was none, because the language was clean, deliberate, final. Withdrawal of guarantee, termination of occupancy, restriction of brand usage. Each sentence not loud, but absolute. And then, the smallest detail. Attached beneath the documents, a brass key tag. Engraved, the master access key to the showroom. Placed there like punctuation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Because there are silences that aren't empty. They're full of realization, of recalculation, of fear. Victor moved first. He reached for his phone, dialed, held it to his ear, waited. Nothing. He ended the call, dialed again, and again. Faster now, less composed. By the third attempt, his voice broke through the silence. Pick up. By the sixth, irritation crept in. By the 12th, panic. Helena looked at him sharply. She's not answering? He didn't respond. Didn't need to. The answer was already in the room. Livia stepped back slowly, her gaze moving between the documents and her father. This isn't real, she said, but the words lacked conviction because something inside her had already begun to understand. The structure she thought she stood on was never hers. Victor lowered the phone slowly, his expression tightening into something unfamiliar. Not authority, not control. Absence of both. At 9:05 a.m., he said it quietly, almost to himself. I can't reach her. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Not gradually. Completely. Because for the first time, the person they had treated as optional had become unreachable. And somewhere, far from the showroom, Elara Quinn sat in silence. Not watching. Not reacting. Already beyond the moment they were just beginning to understand. They arrived just before noon. Not announced. Not invited. Of course, they didn't call first. People like Victor Quinn didn't ask for access. They assumed it. The knock on Elara's door was sharp, controlled, almost polite if you didn't listen too closely. But underneath it, there was something else. Urgency. Elara stood in the middle of her living room for a moment before moving. She had known this would happen. Not if. When. Still, knowing something doesn't make the moment smaller. It just makes it clearer. She opened the door, and there they were. All of them. Victor stood at the front, coat thrown on hastily, one side slightly misaligned, as if he had dressed faster than his usual precision allowed. His expression was already arranged into something composed, but not quite stable. Helena stood beside him, posture perfect, lips curved into that familiar social smile that always appeared just before she said something designed to wound without raising her voice. Livia stood slightly behind, arms crossed, her face tight with something sharper than anger. And beside her, Grant, half a step back, watching, learning, understanding more than anyone had intended him to. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then Victor stepped forward, as if reclaiming space by default. "That's enough," he said. "We're not doing this through paperwork. We're going to talk like adults." Elara didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't invite them in. Instead, she leaned lightly against the doorframe, her expression calm in a way that made the air between them feel uneven. "Which adults?" she asked quietly. Victor blinked. The question landed before he could deflect it. "The ones who don't ignore their own daughter on Christmas?" she added. There it was. Direct. Unsoftened. Helena stepped in immediately, her voice smooth. "You're turning a misunderstanding into something unnecessary." A misunderstanding. The phrase hung there almost elegant in its distortion. Elara tilted her head slightly. "What exactly was misunderstood?" she asked. "The part where you said I wasn't worth the money?" Helena's smile tightened. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" No answer, of course, because clarity had never been their language. Livia exhaled sharply, rolling her eyes. "Oh my God, here we go," she muttered. "You always do this. Take things too literally. Make everything dramatic." "Literal?" Elara interrupted, still calm. "You said I wasn't on your level." "That was a joke." The word came quickly. Too quickly. As if labeling it that way could undo it. Elara studied her for a moment. Not with anger. With recognition. Interesting. A quiet thought moved beneath the surface, steady and precise. How cruelty becomes humor the moment it's questioned. Victor stepped forward again, lowering his voice as if intimacy could replace accountability. "This has gone far enough," he said. "Whatever you think this is, it's out of proportion." Elara's gaze shifted to him. "Finally, out of proportion," she repeated softly. He nodded, seizing the ground. "You're attacking the business, the family. Over what? A holiday incident?" There it was. Reduction, simplification, rewriting. Elara straightened slightly, no longer leaning on the doorframe. "The documents are valid," she said. "The deadlines are real. If you want to discuss next steps, you can do it through counsel." Silence, not confusion. Shock. Because that was not the response they expected. Victor's expression changed. The polished surface cracked, just slightly, but enough. "You wouldn't have that building without me," he said, the words slipping out sharper than intended. Elara didn't react, didn't raise her voice. "Maybe not," she said. "But you wouldn't still be inside it without me." The sentence landed clean. Undeniable. Behind him, Grant shifted, just slightly. "But enough," Livia noticed. Her jaw tightened. Helena tried again, this time with emotion. "You're humiliating us," she said, her voice trembling just enough to feel controlled. "People are already talking. Clients will ask questions. This affects all of us." Elara held her gaze. "Did Christmas affect me?" she asked. Helena's expression faltered. "That's not the same." "It is to me." The air shifted again. Heavier now, more exposed. Livia stepped forward, her composure cracking into something sharper. "This is because you're jealous," she said. "You've never been the face of anything. Not the business, not the family." There it was. Finally. Not hidden, not softened. Truth. Distorted, but honest in its intention. Elara looked at her for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Do you know whose guarantee kept your inventory line open this quarter?" Livia blinked, confusion flickering. "What are you talking about? Dad handles that." Elara's eyes moved back to Victor. "Did you tell her?" she asked. Victor didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because in that moment, something broke, not loudly, but permanently. Livia's expression shifted. Color draining. Understanding. Not complete, but enough. Grant spoke for the first time. "Wait, what guarantee?" No one answered him, because the illusion required silence. Victor stepped closer again, lowering his voice. "This can still be handled privately," he said. "You don't need to make this public." Elara almost smiled, not out of amusement, out of clarity. "If I'm so unimportant," she said, "why did all of you come here the second I stopped protecting you?" No one answered. Because there was no version of the truth that didn't expose them. The silence stretched. Long, uncomfortable, final. And in that silence, the hierarchy they had spent years maintaining collapsed. The shift didn't stay private for long. It never does when pride is involved. By the next morning, the narrative had already begun to spread. Quietly at first, then with increasing confidence, like a story rehearsed just enough times to sound believable. Helena Quinn started it, not directly. She never did anything directly. Instead, she called people. Relatives first, then friends, then acquaintances who existed just close enough to matter, but distant enough to carry the story further without questioning it too closely. Her voice, carefully measured, carried a familiar tone. Concern layered over disappointment. "She's not herself," she would say. "I think the pressure got to her. We're trying to handle it privately, but she's escalating things." Words chosen not to accuse outright, but to suggest, to plant, to frame. Victor took a different approach. He spoke to vendors, business contacts, anyone who had ever depended on the showroom's reputation. "There's been a misunderstanding," he told them. "A temporary internal issue. Nothing structural." Nothing structural. The irony of it almost felt deliberate, because structure was exactly what had been pulled out from beneath him. Still, he spoke with the same confidence he had always relied on. The kind that had carried him through years of appearances, where certainty mattered more than accuracy. And for a moment, it worked, because people believe what fits the version of reality they already prefer. And the Quinn family had spent years building a version that was easy to believe. Elegant, successful, untouchable. Livia, meanwhile, chose visibility. Her platform had always been her territory. By midday, her social media had shifted tone, not dramatically. Subtly, quotes began appearing, carefully selected, aesthetically framed, positioned just ambiguous enough to invite interpretation. Some people confuse bitterness with strength. "Not everyone who shares your blood shares your loyalty." "Grace is staying quiet when others try to tear you down." Each post carried no names, but everyone understood. That was the point. To control the narrative without ever appearing to engage in it. To look composed, wronged, above it. And for those watching from the outside, it created doubt. Because doubt is easier to accept than truth, when truth requires you to reevaluate what you thought you knew. By late afternoon, the calls began reaching Elara, not from her immediate circle, from the extended one. An aunt, a cousin, a family friend she hadn't spoken to in years. The tone was always the same. Careful, curious, judging. just beneath the surface. We heard there's some tension. Your father is very concerned. Are you sure you're not taking this too far? Too far. Elara listened to each message once, then saved them, then forwarded them to her attorney. No replies, no corrections. Because she understood something now that she hadn't fully accepted before. People rarely want the truth. They want the version that allows them to stay comfortable. Strange. The thought surfaced quietly as she set her phone down. How quickly 6 years of support becomes a rumor. The moment it stops benefiting others. The next call came from a vendor. Not accusatory. Careful. Measured. I just wanted to check, the man said, his voice low. There's talk that the showroom might lose access to the premises? Elara paused briefly, not because she didn't know what to say, because she recognized the moment. This was where perception began to shift into consequence. The structure is changing, she replied simply. You'll want to review your exposure? Silence on the other end. Then, understood. The call ended quickly after that. Professional. Efficient. But the implication was clear. The ripple had reached the surface, and now it would spread. Back at the showroom, the atmosphere had changed. Subtle, but undeniable. Staff spoke more quietly. Movements felt less certain. Questions lingered longer than usual, because even if no one said it directly, they could feel it. Stability doesn't disappear all at once. It flickers first, and people notice flickers. Victor sensed it too. Of course he did. Which was why by evening he made his next move, a more aggressive one. Not public. Not yet. But deliberate. He contacted his lawyer. Because if narrative couldn't control the situation, he would try structure, ownership claims, historical intent, implied agreements, anything that could reframe the reality that was beginning to close in around him, anything that could turn uncertainty back into authority. Because men like Victor didn't panic loudly. They escalated quietly. But quietly didn't mean harmless. Across the city, Elara sat by the window again, the lights below shifting in soft reflections across the glass. Her phone rested beside her, still now. Silent, but heavier than before, because silence no longer meant absence. It meant movement, invisible, unfolding. Inevitable. She exhaled slowly, her gaze distant but focused, as if watching something no one else could see yet. And beneath that calm, another thought settled in. Not sharp, not emotional, just certain. They're not trying to understand you. They're trying to survive you. And for the first time, that didn't feel like something to fix. It felt like something already decided. The packet arrived on a Thursday afternoon, not by courier, by email. Clean subject line, formal tone. Attached documents labeled with the kind of confidence that suggested certainty, ownership claims, internal records, supporting exhibits. At first glance, it looked legitimate. That was the point. Elara opened it without urgency, her movements steady, almost detached. She had expected something like this, not the exact form, but the attempt itself. Because when control slips, people don't always let go. They rewrite. She scrolled through the first document, then the second, then stopped, not abruptly, but precisely. Her eyes settled on a page titled Board Minutes, formatted cleanly, structured to resemble internal agreement, dated years back, referencing decisions she knew had never happened, a meeting that had never existed, a consensus that had never been reached, a version of reality constructed after the fact. Her expression didn't change. But something inside her did. Not shock. Recognition. So this is where we are now. The thought moved quietly beneath the surface. Not misunderstanding. Not denial. But invention. She continued reading. An internal memo, fabricated. Language mimicking hers, but not quite right. Close enough to pass at a distance. Wrong enough to fail under scrutiny. Then, her signature, or something meant to resemble it, placed carefully at the bottom of a page that should never have existed. For a moment, the room felt very still. Not heavy, not overwhelming. Just exact, because there is a difference between conflict and betrayal. Conflict can be argued. Betrayal redraws the entire map. Elara closed the file, then opened it again. Not to confirm, To observe, to understand the level of risk they were willing to take. Because this wasn't desperation alone. It was calculation, a belief that she would hesitate, that she would soften, that she would still be the version of herself they had always relied on. The one who absorbed, the one who adjusted, the one who chose silence over escalation. She reached for her phone and called her attorney. The line connected quickly. "I've received their response," Ilara said. A pause. "Anything notable?" Ilara exhaled once, then said 2 words. They forged. Silence. Not confusion, not disbelief. Just a shift. Her attorney's voice, when it returned, was lower. Sharper. "Send everything, now." Ilara forwarded the files immediately, attaching nothing else. No explanation. No commentary. Because the documents spoke for themselves. Minutes passed. Then the call came back. "They're not even careful," her attorney said, voice tight with something controlled. "Metadata shows the file was created 3 days ago, modified twice." Ilara leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. 3 days ago. After Christmas. After the package. After everything had already begun. "They thought I wouldn't check," she said quietly. "No," her attorney replied. "They thought you wouldn't push." That distinction mattered, because it wasn't ignorance. It was assumption. The same assumption that had shaped everything before this. That Ilara would remain contained within the role they had built for her. Even now. Even here. Interesting. The thought surfaced, calm but cutting. How people escalate the moment they realize kindness is no longer protecting them. "Next steps?" Ilara asked. Her attorney didn't hesitate. "We respond hard." And they did. Within hours, a formal notice was drafted. Demand to preserve all records, challenge to the validity of submitted documents, direct accusation of reliance on falsified material. Clean. Precise. Unavoidable. Simultaneously, filings were prepared. Declaratory relief to confirm ownership, enforceable control over the brand, and immediate legal recognition of the structural reality Victor had tried to blur. The bank was notified. That part mattered, because banks don't operate on narrative.
They operate on risk.
And once risk becomes visible, everything tightens.
Lines freeze.
Approvals stall. Trust recalibrates. By the next morning, 2 pending inventory shipments had been paused, not canceled. Not yet, but delayed long enough to signal something deeper. Instability.
Back at the showroom, the effect was immediate.
Staff noticed. Of course they did. Suppliers asking questions. Calls not returning as quickly. Victor's tone shifting. Subtle, but sharp enough for those who knew him to recognize. Livia's posts stopped. Not entirely. But the frequency changed. Confidence replaced by something less certain. Less controlled. Because narratives are easy to maintain. Until facts begin to surface. That afternoon, Ilara received a call she hadn't expected.
Grant.
She let it ring once, twice, then answered. "I don't need details," he said quickly, his voice strained in a way that didn't belong to the version of him she had seen before. "I just need to know one thing." Ilara waited. A brief pause. Then, "Is any of this actually hers?" The question hung there.
Not about money.
Not about conflict.
About truth.
Ilara's answer was simple. No. Silence followed.
Longer this time.
He exhaled slowly.
"I'm right," he said.
And in that single word, something else shifted.
Not legally.
Personally, because illusions don't collapse all at once. They fracture.
Piece by piece.
Call by call. Document by document. Ilara ended the call and set her phone down. The room was quiet again. But not like before. This silence wasn't waiting. It was moving forward. And as she sat there, the final realization settled fully into place. Not heavy, not emotional, just absolute. They didn't think you would fight, so they forced you to. The courtroom was smaller than people expected. Not grand, not cinematic, just a rectangular space under harsh fluorescent lights where everything felt less dramatic and far more real. Ilara Quinn arrived early, not out of anxiety, out of habit. Preparation had always been her language. She sat quietly at the table beside her attorney, a neat stack of documents aligned in front of her. No movement wasted. No expression unnecessary. Across the room, the door opened. Victor Quinn entered first. Gray suit. Immaculate. Carefully chosen, as if fabric could still communicate authority when everything else had begun to fracture. Helena followed, posture rigid, expression composed into something between offense and disbelief. Livia came last. No camera, no filters. Just tension she hadn't learned how to hide yet. For a brief moment, their eyes met Ilara's. Not as a family, as opposition. That, more than anything, marked the shift. They took their seats. Their attorney leaned in, speaking quietly, his tone measured but lacking the confidence he had carried before. Because by now, he had read everything. The room settled, papers adjusted, voices lowered. Then the judge entered, and just like that, performance ended. Structure began. The proceedings moved quickly. Not rushed, efficient, because this wasn't a story to be told. It was a structure to be examined. Ilara's side was presented first. Clean, linear, uncomplicated. Title history, transfer records, financial interventions, guaranteed documentation, trademark assignment. Each piece placed not for effect, but for confirmation. Nothing exaggerated, nothing implied, just facts. Her attorney didn't raise her voice, didn't need to, because truth, when documented properly, doesn't rely on volume. It relies on weight. Then came the opposing side. Their attorney stood, adjusting his jacket slightly before beginning. Voice steady, but just a fraction too careful. He introduced the argument. Intent. Family structure. Implied agreements. Equitable ownership through long-term use. It sounded coherent, almost persuasive, until the documents were introduced. The board minutes. The memo. The signature. For a moment, the room held its breath, because on paper, it looked legitimate. That was the danger of it. The judge reviewed the documents silently, then paused. Not long, but enough. Enough for something subtle to shift. Elaborate on the origin of these materials, the judge said. The opposing attorney complied. Carefully, framing, positioning, avoiding specifics where possible. Ilara didn't move, didn't react. But inside, something sharpened. This is the moment. The thought surfaced quietly, precise as ever. Not when truth appears, but when a lie is forced to stand still. Her attorney rose, calm, measured, and then she dismantled it. Not dramatically, methodically. Metadata first, creation date, 3 days after Christmas, modification history, 2 edits before submission. Then, the signature, placed side by side with verified originals. Similar, but not identical. Close enough to deceive, not close enough to withstand scrutiny. Can you explain? Her attorney asked, voice steady. Why a draft document would contain a simulated signature? Silence, not immediate, but inevitable. The opposing attorney shifted, adjusted, attempted to reframe. Preliminary drafting, mislabeling. The judge cut him off. Answer the question. That was the moment. The exact moment when the lie stopped being a strategy and became a liability. Victor was called forward, not dramatically. Just directly. He stood, shoulders still squared, still trying to hold the shape of authority he had worn for years. Have you made payments consistent with ownership of the property? The judge asked. Victor began speaking, not answering, talking about family, about history, about understanding. The judge interrupted. I asked for numbers. A pause. Victor hesitated. For the first time, truly hesitated. Because numbers don't bend. They don't reinterpret. They don't perform. I don't have them with me, he said. The answer landed. Final. Livia was next. Her voice, when she spoke, lacked the polish it once carried. You've publicly represented the business as family-owned, the judge said. Did you disclose the legal structure? Livia swallowed. That's what it is, she said. That's not what I asked. Silence. Again. Because belief is not documentation. And in that room, only one of those mattered. Ilara watched it unfold without expression. Not detached. Not cold. Just clear. Because for years, she had existed inside their version of reality. Now, they were standing inside hers. And it didn't bend. By the time the ruling came, there was no suspense left. Ownership confirmed, occupancy termination upheld, trademark control enforced, and a quiet note regarding the submitted documents. Not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakable. The kind of statement that doesn't accuse directly, but invites consequences. The judge closed the file, and just like that, it was over. Not with impact, with certainty. As people began to move, gather their things, leave. Victor stepped toward Ilara. One last attempt. You've made your point, he said, voice lower now. Is this really necessary? Ilara looked at him for a long moment, then answered simply, yes. Livia stepped forward, anger breaking through what remained of her control. Does this make you feel important? She asked. Ilara held her gaze. No, she said. Being treated like I existed would have been enough. And in that sentence, everything ended. The collapse didn't happen all at once. That would have been easier, cleaner. Instead, it unfolded slowly. Quiet fractures spreading through something that had always depended on the illusion of stability. At first, it was subtle. A delay here, a hesitation there. Vendors began tightening their terms. Not openly, not aggressively, but enough to be felt. Payment windows shortened. Confirmations took longer. Conversations shifted from casual familiarity to careful distance. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. And conditional trust is just instability waiting to surface. The winter collection never launched. Officially, it was postponed. Privately, it was canceled because, without guaranteed access to the showroom and without clear rights to the brand, no one was willing to anchor themselves to something that might disappear mid-season. That was the problem with perception. Once it cracks, everything connected to it becomes fragile. Back inside the showroom, the atmosphere changed in ways no one could fully disguise. The lighting remained perfect, the displays untouched. But the energy, that was gone. Staff moved differently, quieter, more careful. Because uncertainty doesn't need to be announced. It's felt. 2 senior employees resigned within the first week. No confrontation. No statements. Just polite emails and empty desks. They had seen enough to understand where things were heading. And people who depend on stability rarely wait for it to vanish completely before they leave. Livia tried to maintain control. Of course she did. Her world had always existed in presentation. So she adjusted, reframed, pivoted. Her post returned, but not the same. Less confident, more forced. The captions tried to hold the same tone of effortless elegance, but something underneath had shifted. Because it's difficult to sell a lifestyle built on certainty. When certainty no longer exists, engagement dropped. Not dramatically, but steadily. Brand inquiries slowed, then stopped. Not out of judgment, out of risk. Because association, in her world, was everything. And instability was contagious. Grant left quietly. No announcement, no public statement. Just absence. His things gone from her space, his presence removed from her life. Some endings don't require explanation. They reveal themselves in what's no longer there. Helena's circle shrank next. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations shorter. Warmer tones replaced by something more neutral, more cautious. Because prestige is a currency that depends entirely on perception. And once perception shifts, so does value. Victor held on the longest. Not because he had more control, because he had more to lose. He remained at the showroom daily, overseeing what was left with a kind of rigid determination that bordered on denial. Inventory was boxed, fixtures dismantled, orders canceled or renegotiated. Everything reduced into manageable pieces, because breaking something down is easier than admitting it's already broken. When the final deadline approached, the building felt different. Not empty, not yet, but no longer theirs. That distinction mattered. Ilara arrived that morning with her attorney. And a locksmith. No announcement. No confrontation, just process. The doors opened. The space inside still looked the same at first glance, but closer. Details told a different story. Inventory tags missing, display items damaged, fixtures bent or scratched, not destroyed, altered, deliberately. The kind of damage that doesn't scream, but costs time, money, precision, petty but effective. Ilara walked through it slowly, her gaze moving across the room without visible reaction. Not because it didn't matter, because it didn't change anything. At the center of the showroom, on the main display table, there was a box. White, familiar.
She stopped,
Looked at it for a moment,
then opened it.
inside, a single tag. Blank.
No name.
No message, just empty space where something should have been. Beneath it, a small handwritten note. Some things never change. Ilara stared at it quietly. Not hurt,
Not surprised.
just aware. Of course, the thought surfaced, calm and distant. Even now, they need the story to remain the same. Because if the story changed, they would have to. She closed the box gently, slipped the tag into her coat pocket. Not as a memory. As a marker, the locksmith cleared his throat softly. Do you want this disposed of? Ilara shook her head. No! Her voice was steady,
Certain.
because some things weren't meant to be erased. They were meant to be remembered correctly. By the time they finished, the showroom was no longer a space. It was a transition, stripped of identity, waiting for something else to define it. Victor wasn't there.
Not that day.
Not for the end. Whether by choice or avoidance, it didn't matter.
Because absence, at that point, said everything presence couldn't.
Outside, the air was colder than it had been weeks before.
Sharper.
Clearer. Ilara stepped out onto the street, pausing briefly as the door closed behind her. For a moment, she stood still,
Not looking back.
not moving forward, just existing between what had been and what no longer was. And beneath that stillness, one final realization settled. Not heavy,
Not emotional, just true.
It was never about taking something from them. It was about no longer giving them what they never valued. 4 months later, the building was sold. Not quietly, but cleanly. The kind of transaction that didn't leave loose ends. Only conclusions. A hospitality group from another city acquired it, their plans already in motion before the final signatures dried. Renovation crews moved in within weeks, stripping away what remained of the showroom's identity with efficient precision. New walls,
New lighting. New purpose.
as if the space had been waiting all along to become something else. Ilara didn't attend the closing in person. She didn't need to. Some endings are better handled without witnessing them twice. Instead, she reviewed the documents from her office, smaller than her father's had been, but sharper in its intent. Focused, structured, built not on appearance, but on function. Her new firm had taken shape quickly. Distressed assets,
Transitional structures.
complex ownership disputes, the kind of work most people avoided because it required seeing things as they were, not as they were presented. She was good at it,
Not because she enjoyed conflict.
but because she understood it, understood how easily people confuse control with ownership, how often silence gets mistaken for agreement, how many systems survive not on strength, but on the assumption that no one will challenge them. On the wall behind her desk, framed simply in black, hung the tag, the same one, blank, no name, no inscription.
Just absence, preserved.
Clients sometimes asked about it, not often, but enough. What is it? They would say, curious but unsure. Ilara never gave them the full story. She didn't need to. It's a reminder, she would reply, and leave it at that, because some lessons don't translate well into explanations. They exist better as understanding. Outside of work, the noise faded. Not immediately, but steadily. People talked, of course. They always do. Some called her ruthless. Others said she had only done what anyone in her position would have done. A few insisted there had to be more to the story. Because no one destroys a family over something as small as Christmas gifts. That version always lingered the longest. The simplest one. The easiest one to believe. Ilara never corrected it, because correcting it would require people to confront something uncomfortable. That it had never been about the gifts. It had been about structure. About position. About the quiet agreement that she would continue giving without ever being acknowledged as the one holding everything in place. Strange, the thought surfaced one evening as she locked her office, how people reduce years of erosion into a single moment, just so they don't have to examine what led to it. Her family adapted, in the way people always do when adaptation becomes unavoidable. Victor reopened in a smaller space, outside the district that had once defined his reputation. The name changed, the scale reduced, the certainty gone. Helena appeared less in the circles she once moved through so easily. Not excluded, just no longer central. And Livia, she tried. Rebranded, repositioned. But influence built on borrowed ground rarely survives when the ground is taken away. She and Grant never reconciled. Some fractures don't repair. They redefine. Victor wrote to her 3 times. The first letter was angry. The second, restrained. The third, different. Shorter, quieter. He asked a question. Why had she become so cold? Ilara read that one twice, not because it was difficult to understand, because it revealed something so clearly. He still believed the change had started with her. Not with the moment he chose silence while she sat there with nothing. Not with the years before that. Just with her response. For a brief second, she considered replying. Not out of obligation. Out of clarity. But the thought passed. Because some questions aren't asked to understand. They're asked to preserve a version of reality that no longer exists. And she had already stepped out of it. Completely. Winter came again. Quieter this time. Colder. Cleaner. On a morning much like the one where everything had begun. Ilara stood by her window, watching the city move beneath a pale sky. No calls, no messages, no noise, just space. And within that space, something settled. Not triumph, not relief, something steadier. Peace, not the kind that comes from winning. The kind that comes from no longer needing to prove anything at all. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the frame on the wall. The blank tag, still unchanged, still empty, but no longer representing absence. Now, it meant something else entirely. A boundary, a decision, a moment where everything aligned, not in her favor, but in truth. And as she stood there, one final thought moved through her mind, quiet and certain. Not sharp, not heavy, just complete. Blood doesn't make something yours. Silence doesn't make something fair. And being tolerated was never the same as belonging. She turned away from the window, back to her desk, back to her work, forward, without hesitation, without regret, and without ever needing to look back again.